Hey everyone, welcome to the Bay Area Content Marketing Meetup. We're now meeting on Thursdays. So if you've checked our schedule recently, we have decided that Thursday is our day of the week. You'll see that we have a schedule of Thursdays for the foreseeable future. Really excited today to have Andria Tay join us. Andria is a longtime member of our meetup, and when we went to exclusively online, it was more convenient for Andria to attend. So she's been attending, and I'm so happy she agreed to present to us today. Andria is Director of Content Marketing at Narvar, and she's going to talk about research and data programs that fuel thought leadership. Andria, thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I asked this right before this call began, but basically trying to get an understanding of how many of you had done surveys in your own work, whether it be of consumers or clients. And it sounds like a lot of you have not yet. So hopefully this is some new ways to think about how you can fuel all of your content, really, and more importantly, look at this from a thought leadership standpoint. So as Dennis said, I had content marketing for Narvar. So a little bit about me and a little bit about the company I work for. So not only do I handle content marketing for us, but also PR and social. So it is a really nice kind of rounded way to be the voice of the company. Because Narvar is we are a startup, right? We're still fairly new company, but we work with a lot of enterprise customers. And at this point, it's probably over 700 around the world. And so if you've bought anything online besides from somebody like Amazon, you've most likely interacted with us. We handle the post-purchase part of the journey. So everything from when you bought something from a retailer, we handle all the order tracking and the communication around that. If anything changes, we'll let you know. We also handle returns and exchanges. So those are sort of our wheelhouses. And I actually came from the music industry originally. So this is kind of a bit of a second career for me. I transitioned quite a while ago from content being my product to content being my channel. So that's kind of the way I look at things. But in this role, one of the things that attracted me to Narvar, and I've been here about 4 years, is their commitment to thought leadership. So this idea of, how do you create a category, really being able to speak to the C-suite at a lot of these companies in a way that makes you a little bit more of a consultative partner than just a vendor. So that's been a lot of my focus. And so the way I look at content and the purpose of what we're doing here is to pave the way for those conversations we want to have in the future. So being able to look, 6, 12 months, 18 months down the line and say, okay, what products might we be coming out with, or, where do we want to be as a company? How do I help start those conversations early? And data is a big piece of this. So thought leadership it can be a bit of a funny term, right? People sometimes think it's fluff, but I found this, which I thought was really interesting. Edelman and LinkedIn did a survey of people who consume thought leadership to kind of get an understanding of what how they find value in it. And obviously high value content thought leadership content is something that is a little more provocative, right? It inspires different ways for people to think about the industry or tackling different problems, and also includes some sort of recommendation as to how they can take that information and apply it to their own business or thinking. So, that's sort of the framework of how we look at this. It's a little bit broader than kind of the typical content marketing hat of, okay, how do I get people down the funnel and understand our value proposition and that sort of thing. It's a little bit broader than that. But even then, right, it can be fluffy. So that's where data comes in. And obviously you can use third-party data, which is really helpful to bolster your arguments. But, what I wanted to talk about today is how we at Narvar have, over the 4 years that I've been here, really used proprietary data, whether it's coming from our platform or more importantly, surveys that pretty much anybody could do. I shouldn't give away that secret, but if you do it right, it provides that additional credibility and authority to your thought leadership. So here's an example that I really love. When we had the Napa earthquake, right? This was 2014. I don't know how many of you remember this, but Jawbone came out with this chart, right? Fitness tracking. They're tracking people's sleep habits. And what I thought was fascinating about this is obviously, what does fitness tracking have to do with earthquakes? They were able to show when people woke up and where the epicenter was, right? This garnered all kinds of press for them because it all of a sudden put them in a different space, right? They're able to comment on culture more broadly, on people's behavior, and it gave them an entry point into a conversation, which I thought was fascinating. So more importantly, how do you maybe tackle this, right? So I'll walk you through how we've done it. Your mileage may vary, but we'll start with kind of more strategically how I think about this, which I think is really the more interesting and more valuable thing. And then I will also include a few tactical tips. And if you guys have questions in the meantime, please do interject. Any questions or thoughts so far? Okay, cool. So as I mentioned earlier, right, most content marketing, you kind of are thinking more specifically about how do I move people down the funnel, how do I get our point of view across? When you're trying to come up with data content that is going to be more broadly valuable, it's almost better to take that hat off and put on your journalist hat or just your lifelong learner hat, right? Natural curiosity is going to be your best asset. And there's a couple ways to kind of frame up how you start thinking about what kind of data project could we come up with that would be valuable here. So one is, kind of the easier one, which is what industry stats do we wish we had? There's going to be times when you're writing stuff and you say, wow, I wish we had this thing that proved this kind of consumer behavior, but we don't. Maybe you can go get it. Another is, there's a lot of people producing data, so you want to try to stand out in that noise, but sometimes that's hard because people are asking a lot of different questions about the same thing. One of the ways to do that is really to look at, is there an area that you could dive deeper on? So maybe people are saying, hey, voice devices like Google Homes are going to be at a tipping point this Christmas, which is exactly what we did 2 years ago, right? There was a lot of conversation around it, but people weren't really talking about it in the context of shopping. Or if they were, it was sort of superficial and very much about the transaction. So we were able to take that and dive a little bit deeper into, okay, consumers, how would you want to use this? And do you really envision yourself using it for these different types of shopping? So that's one way you can come up with something that's a little bit more unique. Another is, are there things that are kind of commonly accepted or even kind of debated, but there's no data behind it to kind of like quantify it? This one is one of my favorites, and it's actually something that we've been able to hang our hats on at Narvar because returns is such a big part of what we do, and it's mainly for online companies, right? Or e-commerce companies. How many of you, when you shop yourselves online, buy more than one version of an item because you're not sure? I see smiles. Because you're not sure about sizing or color or fit, right? You're basically turning your home into a living room because you have to. It's different from shopping in a store. This is obviously like a major pain point for retailers. Everybody kind of knows consumers are doing it, but there wasn't really a number around it until we asked about it, I guess 3 or 4 years ago at this point, 3 years ago, and put a number on it and named it. And that has actually yielded us a lot of traction. And then the last thing I would say is, as you're thinking about this, is really how do you get to the why of things? So not just, hey, X number of consumers are doing this thing, but why are they doing this thing? Like that is really where some of that quality is going to come in, that will get you more interest from everybody from journalists to C-suite. And obviously you can leverage a lot of this in your traditional content marketing. Any questions so far? Okay. So the next step really, once you kind of frame that up, is start at the end and work backwards. The way that I think is best to do this, that makes it a little bit more concrete, is write some ideal headlines, right? Like what would you want to see published out there, or what would you want to publish which will help you then kind of like back up into, okay, how do we get to this answer? It also helps because I was talking to Dennis a little bit before this call started about, you know, his experience with doing this before, and it can be a big project, right? But it can be really worth it. But it is hard to not try to boil the ocean. So by kind of putting that vision out there, it'll help you narrow things down and make it manageable. And again, from a framing perspective, if you really are looking to get PR coverage and get the most out of this, there are two really key things that I think are important to think about. One is, you know, newsjacking. What is going on in the public conversation right now? What is of interest that you might be able to work into your program? That is probably the most important thing to think about. Another is, are there trends that you would want to track over time? So again, going back to the bracketing idea, we ask it every time we do a study on returns at this point, because that gives us that way of saying, not only is this a super interesting thing, but we can tell you how that consumer behavior is changing over time, or by geo and that sort of thing. The one other thing I will say, and again, your particular situation may be different, but one thing we have found is that between surveys of consumers versus retailers or clients of some sort, generally you're going to get more broad traction for consumer behavior, right? There's just more use cases and applications for it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't also do the other. Pausing for questions.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I love this approach of starting at the end and working backwards. It reminds me of building products. So I often hear this advice that when you build a new product or a new product release, you write the press release for what you want the resulting coverage to be, and then you work backwards and build that product that the press release talks about, which I love.
Yeah, yeah, it's great. It's a great way to manage scope.
Yeah.
Cool. So here's an example of that, right? Again, painting your vision, and also having a little bit of a hypothesis, right? That's sort of the natural thing. But so for us, again, you know, one of the things we help our retailers do is compete in, you know, an Amazon dominated world. So that is one aspect that we also look at is, you know, how do we look at what Amazon is doing right and be able to compare how consumers feel about them versus everybody else. So you'll see some of that in here. Things like, you know, as a typical retailer, you're not going to be able to compete with Amazon on speed of delivery, the Walmarts of the world. So, you know, how else could we help them do that? The other is that, you know, our philosophy is that by communicating with customers during that period where they've already placed their trust in you by giving them your money, you need to make sure that they're not wondering if that stuff's going to show up or when, or so. So we do believe that that better communication drives loyalty. So those were the kinds of things we tested out. And then this is another important thing. And this is something that I would recommend you think about kind of periodically through this process. So right up front, think about how could you slice and dice the information to make it a little more interesting. So things like, you know, how do people feel about Amazon's experience versus everybody else? That means that when you construct your questionnaire, you need to be able to slice that way, right? So whether it's asking people specifically about Amazon, or the way we did it is we said, hey, so the last return you made of an online purchase, was it to Amazon or was it to a non-Amazon? And so that just made it really easy for us to slice all of the answers in the questionnaire that way. There's obvious demographic things by category, you know, there's lots of stuff here. You'll want to do this again on sort of the analysis side of things. So once you've gotten all your answers, you'll obviously slice and dice and kind of see what's interesting there. The one warning I'll give you on this is just make sure that, you know, say if it's luxury shoppers versus anyone else, and you've surveyed 1,000 people and only 5 of them said that the last purchase was luxury, then take that with a grain of salt, right? It may not be enough meat there. So a couple of other tips. Normally, like the example I always think about is from a brand perspective, right? People say, hey, if you took this web page and pulled the logo off it, would you still know it's Coca-Cola? Like that's a perfect example of branding. With a questionnaire, you almost want to do the opposite. If you took that questionnaire and did not have a logo on it, would people be able to kind of suspect who's asking these questions? You want that answer to be no, because that way you're going to get the most credible, authentic data. And then same with the questions. And this is a little harder, but you know, it comes with experience. It's just sort of understanding how do you ask these questions so that you're not leading people, but you're still going to get kind of the data that you want out of this. Another is use qualifying questions to get more relevant respondents. So what I mean by this is, you know, say returns. How many people have actually returned something they bought online? We want to make sure that when we're asking them all these specific questions about that experience, that they've done it recently enough that you know, it's not kind of useless for us, that they're not guessing at stuff. So right up front, we'll ask a question: have you returned something that you purchased online within the last 6 months? For the people who said no, they don't get to answer any more questions because it's not helpful to us. And so those other people, it's like you get kind of better quality data that way. And then make your questionnaire. The reason I say make your questionnaire easy to complete, if you do research on how people recommend you do this, a lot of them will talk about length. And length is obviously a factor. You don't want people, you know, abandoning ship halfway through. But at the same time, that's not the only aspect. You can use a variety of types of questions. So things like, you know, radio boxes versus rating scales versus, you know, a bunch of different things. Like there's a bunch of different options, so multiple choice. That also helps to kind of make it just sort of easier for people to get through. And then the other is to chunk it down. So if you think about it almost like an article, right, where you would normally organize things in kind of subheaders, you can do that with a questionnaire as well. So even if you're asking 30 questions, if you're putting them into some sort of context, so people don't have to context switch all the time, and you can even put a little text at the head of that section. So it's like, hey, for these next questions, think about the last gift return you made, right? That alone will just help them kind of get in the right mindset to kind of blow through the next set of questions in a way that will be useful to you. And then the last one kind of goes in hand with that is test like crazy. And when I say that, it's like, send that preview link to a bunch of different people that you trust, because not only are you testing for just functionality and making sure that things work right, if you're using like skip logic, things like if you said no, then skip them to, you know, the third question down. You want to test for those things, but you also just want to make sure that it's comprehensible and people can get through it and they're not confused, because you're not going to be able to do that after you deploy. Actually, I'll go through two more things before I ask for questions. So here's a couple of examples, and these two things are going to look like they contradict each other, but just some ways as you're putting together your questionnaire to think about it. Something like this, where, you know, we also wanted to get a sense of, you know, subscription services, how people are using those, because there's sort of a built-in return process there. And we wanted to make sure that was separated from everything else, but we did want to know. But instead of putting this in two questions, like, hey, do you subscribe to one of these things? Yes or no? And if you do, why do you? Or why don't you? We just rolled it up into one, right? This is a question that we wanted to get to, but it wasn't critical. On the other hand, when you've got something really important, like we want to understand how you felt about your last return experience, why you felt that way, and how is that driving your loyalty? That's one where we really did take the time to blow this out, but by putting it in the sequence, it's logical to get through. It's still relatively easy. As you can see, there's really just the one question that you kind of have to think about pretty hard. And again, you can slice and dice all this stuff. People who thought their experience was good, here's why, here's how that affects their loyalty versus not. So now I'll pause for questions.
Andrea, you gave that example. I'm not sure if they call this like conditional branching or not. Like if you choose option B, then we take you down to another question, a follow-up based on the fact that you answered it as B.
Yep.
Do you use that a lot? And what is the usefulness of doing that?
The usefulness of doing that primarily is to make the questionnaire easier for the respondent, right? If this thing isn't relevant, then don't bombard them with 3 more questions. You can skip them ahead.
Okay.
But it still gives you that opportunity to delve deeper with people who do have answers.
Got it. Okay. And for anyone else, feel free to use the chat if that's a more
Andrea,
convenient
I
way
have
to
a
ask questions.
question. Maybe you said this. Did you say what an ideal number of questions is? Because 17 questions, I don't know if that's the last one. Seems like a lot. So that's one question. And then the other one is, what about the ones like, if yes, then skip to question 5. Can you talk a little bit? You might be already going to talk about that, if you know what I mean, like the choose your adventure kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is that good or bad? Okay.
So as far as length of questions, I didn't specify a number because, again, I really believe that it's not just about the number of questions. It's about how you ask them and how you flow people through it, which is why I think, the ways you ask these questions. So like the one that's on the screen right now is a good example because it's 4 questions, right? Which seems like a lot when you're trying to kind of minimize the number. But because if you had to answer this, it's really not that hard, right? It's kind of one question. Because you're asking a couple of different things about this one experience, but it's pretty quick to get through, right? So it's just thinking about it from a different perspective than just sheer number of questions. And then as far as, again, the branching or skipping, that is a bit of a trick to be able to, the way I would think about it is almost like, if you're trying to segment your respondents and treat them differently, it's like, if I don't have anything to say about, like, I didn't return a gift, then don't take me through 3 other questions about that gift, right? Just skip me ahead to the next thing. Whereas if I did return a gift, then we want to know how you felt about that, send them through a few additional ones. Does that make sense? Any others right now?
Yeah, and another question. So user fatigue is what I'm thinking, or respondent fatigue is what I'm thinking about. Are you better to ask open-ended questions towards the end or at the beginning? Is there a thought?
That's an excellent question. We try to avoid open-ended questions unless we feel like we want to get a little bit more color around something that we can't kind of chunk into something like this, right? Where it's multiple choice or whatever. So like other, right? Every now and then you need another because you're not sure that there's something else that you should be capturing there. So I would say use them sparingly. I do like the idea of if you are asking for something that's very kind of like, give us your broad opinion on this thing or any other comments, I would definitely stick that at the end. Because you don't want it to be a like,
Right, yeah, thank you.
Sure.
I have a comment, not necessarily a question, but there are some, I mean, while we do this research to understand, what users' desires, needs, wants are, there's some outliers, and some of them are really smart outliers like Steve Jobs, etc., who have a different opinion, which is, the users really don't know what they want. And so you build products or solutions based on what you think the world needs, and that's where innovation comes in, which is essentially don't pay attention to any of the research, in another way of saying that, right? Mm-hmm. So what's your thoughts on, where, and some of these guys are brilliant and smart, and they go about and they change the world because their users really don't know what they want, and that's proven. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, again, that comes down to how you construct what you're asking. Because if you ask them, hey, would you prefer this theoretical thing or that theoretical thing, right? That's what these guys are kind of getting to. That's a lot harder because, so like going back to the voice device example, we wanted to avoid that, right? Because if people were already using a device, we wanted to get a better sense of how they were currently using it. a little bit of theoretically how would you use it, but we took that with a grain of salt because of exactly what you're talking about. Like sometimes they don't really know. Or the other thing to do is really to put your consumer hat on and think through a bunch of different options. So you can put at least a few of those options in front of them so they start thinking about, you know, would I use it to add something to a list versus actually execute a transaction versus something else. Like it at least gives them, I think, enough concrete examples that they could apply near term, right? It doesn't feel like, what would you do in 5 years? Would you theoretically want a drone to deliver something like that? I think is a little too far. But if it's something that's close enough related to what they could imagine themselves doing next week, and you give them, you know, you're not leading them too far, you're kind of giving them enough choices to have them understand what the potential is, I think it's not bad.
Thank you.
Let's see. Okay, so more tactically, right? I will be honest, this is all kind of online surveys, right? It's lower touch. I'm not talking about trying to do in-person interviews or anything like that. But other than all of the strategy and structure that goes into this, it becomes fairly easy. Like you need a way to gather the data. You need a way to get to an audience, an unbiased audience, a decent size. 1,000, I think, is good. You don't want an audience that's too small. It just becomes not very credible. And then a way to analyze the information, which is probably one of the hardest things. If you're not a data analyst and you don't have a lot of resources to do this, like how do you get to this information? So this is not a sales pitch. I use SurveyMonkey because they have all of these things. They have, you can use SurveyMonkey audience to buy an audience of the size you need with, you know, a couple of demographic parameters, that sort of thing. It's kind of one-stop shopping. And their analytics tools are really easy. You basically can like slice and dice things and filter them in different ways. And it just becomes really easy. And the charts that are already in there are good. So now a warning for anybody who's seen Death Becomes Her, you'll recognize this image. So a couple of things just to, you know, so you don't worry too much. Be prepared for surprises. So even if you make this questionnaire as objective as possible and you kind of have already painted this picture of where you think you're gonna go and what insights you're going to get, just be prepared. There may be some surprises. Another thing which kind of goes hand in hand with that is, you know, keep an open mind when you're interpreting those results, because it could be that you get something unexpected. You may need to slice it and dice it a couple different ways to kind of understand like, okay, what am I really seeing here? And maybe you need to step back a minute. Like every now and then we do get something where it's like, don't quite understand what this is telling me. And so sometimes looking at it through a couple of different lenses, like, okay, is this happening more with younger people, older people, luxury customers, whatever? Like, does that give you more insight? And if not, it's not that bad to abandon something too. If you just go, every now and then you ask a series of questions and what you get back is just not interesting or useful. Like it doesn't tell you anything. Let it go. And then this is another one. I'll see a lot of smaller companies do this where they say, great, we did the survey. Here's what we think it says. But some of this stuff is just not necessarily trustworthy. Every now and then when you've got an intersection, like one of the things we ask is in the return studies is what category was the last product that you returned? And we're able to do things like we know from industry data from whatever, NRF, the National Retail Federation, that the expected percentage of apparel returns in e-commerce is going to be a certain amount. So like if there's a way to kind of double check those sorts of things against trusted sources, that'll give you more confidence in all of your data. And it makes it easier for you to also present that argument to anybody else. A few more things. So just a couple more. So storytelling with data, obviously this is, once you've gotten all your stuff, everything's awesome. You've got these great insights is, you know, data visualization, pain in the ass, but really critical, right? Because you could have great stats. You can give people bullet points, which actually we've had work great with journalists and stuff is they just kind of want the information a lot of times, but presenting it visually in a way that makes it really easy is important. So I'll share this deck afterwards, obviously. So there's a couple of links to some places to to help you think about how you visualize these. But the way I really look at it again is, how do you encapsulate those key stories into one slide? So it's easy for people to drop into an article, drop into a deck somewhere. It's like, this is the story. And it's easy to grok, right? You don't want people having to stare at that slide for like 5 minutes trying to figure out what you're telling them. As much as possible, make it really easy for them to understand. And then, you also want it to provoke conversation. So you give them enough information, but let it lead to more. And I did see a little, did somebody have a question? I saw something pop up.
Yeah, Megan asked you to explain the term grok, which I think is
Oh.
a lot of developers use, right?
Right. Is understand quickly, right? So make it easy to comprehend at a glance.
So like grasp.
Yes. Grasp quickly and easily. Sorry, I haven't said foo yet, so that's good, right? On my age. So this is the bracketing story, right? So again, we know that people do this because they're using their homes as fitting rooms. So that's right at the top. This was from our global study, so we were able to show, so actually this was something that, one of the reasons that this was really big, being able to put a number on bracketing is, even 3 years ago when we first did this, I expected to see, 15 to 20% of people say they do this regularly. We saw like 41% of people do this regularly. That's a huge problem for retailers. So, so we've been tracking this, and now it's friggin' 48% in the US, which is just nuts. And it's even higher in Germany. But so getting to the why, right? We did ask in subsequent studies, once we kind of knew that we had something here, we asked them why they do it or don't do it. And 15% of them said they only do it because sizing or other options aren't really clear. Which then leads us to a recommendation, right, to our retailers, which is, hey, if you can improve the fit information or, improve the photos that are available on that product detail page, you can actually prevent returns. So all of this helps spur conversation for our salespeople with journalists. And again, it's an easy thing to kind of like take and drop in somewhere. I have lots of other examples, but I'll just give you this one right now. And then this is kind of classic content marketing and marketing in general, right? If you get a really good set of these insights, you can slice and dice on this side too. Like, what besides bracketing could we talk about out of this? Obviously there's the millennials and affluent, so really looking at kind of demographic differences, and maybe you can speak about that from more of a marketing perspective. Again, the Amazon issue and the fact that people, we found that people have to jump through more hoops when they're working with Amazon and trying to return something, things like getting an authorization or, but they actually preferred the experience, and the delta was that they got more communication from Amazon. Plays in perfectly to our story. So there's multiple ways you can do this, and we've used this not only in bylines and PR, but also to help really be that anchor for speaking opportunities when we do our CAB, our customer advisory boards, which again are with C-suite folks. This kind of data provides a really nice kind of springboard for conversations. And then the last thing is really measuring impact. So the way we look at it is, again, from the PR perspective, and this took obviously a few years to build up, but we're starting to get pretty regularly tier 1 coverage about different aspects of our research. This has super long legs as well. We still get coverage of reports that we put out 3 years ago. People will just sort of, find these stats and drop them into things. And then again, from a PR perspective, what this is really showing you is, this is all the PR coverage that we got, based pretty much solely on these reports that we put out in this data. So the gray shows you sort of the overall air cover that we've gotten over the years. The one dip is when we didn't have a report for about a year. And this would be kind of a background to any other coverage you had, but you don't always have product news to talk about. You don't always have a new acquisition or partnership or executive appointment. So this really helps to kind of give you that brand consistency. And then really just as far as takeaways, right? So again, it's important to frame this up the right way right at the beginning. So finding that white space, you know, what can you uniquely talk about and illustrate in your industry. The slicing and dicing is critical all throughout the process. And then, you know, just to make sure for your own sake, you know, validate findings as much as you can, just to make sure that you're on the right track and you're not completely out of whack with what people expect. So I see a bunch of, so questions?
That was great, Andrea. That there's a question in the chat from Diane. What media monitoring tools do you use?
So I use BuzzSumo, which is fairly inexpensive. It's great for also content research, but we monitor all of our coverage and keep competitor coverage that way. And then our PR agency also has TrendKite. So we do track share of voice as a metric. And so that's coming from them. Oh, and a lot of spreadsheets. I just take every single piece of, you know, coverage that we get and put it in a spreadsheet and mark it, whether it's a tier 1 or if it's earned coverage. And when I say earned within the PR sphere, it's like, hey, did we place this or was this a surprise? And we actually measure success on those things.
Oh, and Carol's saying, is it BuzzSumo, and then what was the second tool? TrendKite?
So TrendKite,
okay.
I think is very specific to PR. Again, our PR agency has it, so I don't pay for it.
I have a question on survey design. Let's say someone's watching, says, I'm bought in, I want to do a research project for thought leadership, but that person has no experience designing surveys. How do you think about the pros and cons of like learning it yourself versus bringing someone in to help?
I think a lot of it comes down to budget, right? It's if you have the budget, it's, I think, really helpful to partner with somebody who has experience doing it. We've kind of done it on both sides. I would say actually, from a budget perspective, I would spend the money on the analysis side of it and having partnership there. So if you've got a PR agency or somebody else that you can partner with on both, you know, crafting what is the angle we're going after, as well as what are those storylines that we expect to get out of it. And then also helping to actually look at and tease out the stories when you get the analysis back. That's where I would spend the money.
Okay. And was your own expertise built up from just hands-on experience, or were there other ways you were able to?
And having good partnerships with our PR agency. I mean, we did for a couple of these partner with an industry analyst who was at Forrester, was independent, and then went back to Forrester, and she's a recognized retail expert. So that was helpful. Again, that also helps with credibility to a certain extent, but even when we haven't worked with her, we've done okay.
Okay.
Let's see, talk more about how to analyze. So again, if you use something like SurveyMonkey or something that gives you kind of a good summary, right? That's the best place to start, is take the time to look at that data, just the way it is, individual questions, and kind of see immediately what it's telling you. That will lead you to ask further questions and dig deeper. And this is true not only when you analyze an individual survey, but also I would say you definitely learn over time. Like, I think, you know, when we did our first one, we realized we shouldn't just ask about, do you bracket, but why do you bracket? So you'll figure that out the next time around, you'll ask that question. Or as you have this out in the market, people will ask you questions that you can't answer with the current data, you'll ask it next time. So for an individual survey, I would say it's kind of the same thing. Like you, again, natural curiosity will serve you best, right? Because you'll look at it and you'll say, wow, this is really interesting. I wonder if it could tell me this.
Yeah,
Excellent.
thank you. That's great. I guess I was just asking because, and as I was typing that, you were saying you worked with that former Forrester analyst or whatever it was. So that's what I was wondering, like, do you need to actually have like a data scientist, or can you kind of figure it out on your own with your team?
You can kind of figure it out. I mean, like the first one or two that we did on our own. And I would say that's partly why I would recommend something like SurveyMonkey, right? They've got tools, they've got recommendations that kind of help you through it. Yeah.
So out of curiosity, was the Forrester analyst behind the scenes and helped with analysis, or was it also a PR value of having the analyst be associated with the research?
Yeah, that's a great question. A little bit of both. I will be honest in that I was surprised that we didn't get as much PR traction as we would expect. Like it was a little, there's a certain amount of kind of good housekeeping stamp of approval, right? So did we see better pickup because her name was attached to it? Potentially. Did we get a lot of interview requests specifically for her or those sorts of things? Not as much, but we did also bring her in to help with things like our customer advisory board meetings, right? We'd have her in to help present this data. So that helped. But if you have worked with analyst firms, you know it can be very pricey. So it's got to be kind of worth it.
Yeah. Any final questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat. And Andrea, thanks so much for joining us. I see, I love your Twitter handle, by the way.
Oh, thanks. And I'm spikily because I used to have short spiky hair. I am spiky everywhere else, but somebody's
really?
squatting on that at Twitter forever. So
that's funny.
Yeah. Welcome to take any other questions, by the way, too. And I may throw a little poll into the meetup thing just to get a sense of, you know, what did you guys think of this? What would have been more helpful, less helpful, that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. Feel free to drop a link in the, are you referring to the meetup page?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, feel free to drop a link.
Cool.
I'll get people to fill it out, or I'll ask people to fill it out.
Yeah.
All right, Andrea, thanks again for joining us, and thanks everyone on the line for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone, and stay safe.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.